everyone, and welcome to The Breakouts, a podcast where we interview extraordinary founders in just under 20 minutes. I'm your host, Akkshay Khosla. Now, you'll find many podcasts out there that are 2 to 3 hours long and interview these wildly successful founders after they've already made it big. But by that point, the founders are already 5, 10, or even 15 years into their journey, so their insights just aren't as actionable anymore. We're doing things a little bit different. We're interviewing founders that are on the cusp of breaking out so that you can learn the playbooks they're using to build category-defining companies today. And we're doing it in just under 20 minutes. Now, just before we get started, go ahead and follow us on Twitter at The Breakouts Pod, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and join our Discord community for aspiring founders. The link is in the description below. A real quick disclaimer right before we get started. This episode is one of the first few we recorded, so the audio and video quality isn't that great. We're working to improve it so that we can deliver a better podcast experience for you guys. But regardless, the insights in this episode and the entrepreneur that we interviewed are amazing, so definitely still go ahead and give it a listen. And I think that's everything I have for you. So without further ado, here's today's guest. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of The Breakouts. Today, we have with us once again, Jarrad Aguirre, the co-founder and CEO of Miga Health. He recently raised a 12 million seed round in the health tech space for his company, and he's building something truly inspiring. Now, in our previous episode, in part 1, Jarrad talked about the story behind his startup, how it works, and how he thinks about winning the industry. In this episode, we're going to be focused on strategies, tactics, and hacks that Jarrad has used to build his business. We're going to carve up the episode into 4 different sections. The first part is going to be about product and how he thinks about making product decisions. The second is going to be distribution, how he thinks about acquiring customers. The third is going to be fundraising. And the last one is going to be about how he operationalizes his business. Now, just as we get started, Jarrad, for those of our listeners who might have missed the first episode, could you summarize one more time what your startup does and what problem you guys are solving?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be back on for second episode. But at Miga Health, we're a heart health company combining delightful consumer product and full stack clinical services to prevent the next million heart attacks and strokes. And we're starting in hypertension. And so what we're intently pushing ahead is really building that future of heart health with prevention, at the core. Awesome. Really cool. And for our listeners who missed the first episode, definitely go check it out. A lot of cool things that Jarrad shared about his company and the industry. Now, to get us started on this episode, Jarrad, I'm curious, you probably observed this problem in all of your years studying in medical schools, then next working in a health tech startup. But what was your process for building conviction in this specific problem to the point where you could say that, hey, I'm going to go ahead and dive all into this? As I think about it's sort of a balance between sort of conviction and, risk appetite. I feel like I have an opportunity, but also an obligation to really try to do ambitious work in healthcare because I've been afforded, that chance. And so the way I operate is actually to seek out these large problems that with the right conviction and with the right sort of nuanced strategy, you can affect sort of great change. And so when I decided to step out from my prior company, which was a biotech, and start Miga Health, the conviction really came down to the recognition that heart health is such a huge category, but also that so much of what's needed is implementation of existing best practices and sort of distribution of products, that I'm highly confident, and we're hoping that it will be Miga, but highly confident that there will be a future state where great consumer product and really excellent clinical services come together to really create, a new paradigm in heart health and really sort of usher in companies and businesses that are much, much, much bigger than what we've seen to date. And so my conviction comes from that future state, which I know will happen. And then the leap of faith is that, Miga Health and the build that we're doing and the approach that we're taking is going to sort of make that happen. Very cool. I think that health tech is this interesting space where there's clearly so much green space in terms of what you can build because there are these problems that are just obvious that exist and that previously people haven't solved because of the regulatory issues while building in the space that are, starting to get a little bit better. But what I'm more curious about is the approach that you're taking, right? The approach to your MVP, your approach to the industry and how you're tackling the space, your wedge, etc. What was your process for building conviction in that? Like, how did you determine that, hey, this is the best way to go? Was it a series of user interviews, looking up data? What was kind of involved in that process?
Yeah, there are a couple of sort of steps involved for us. And I think the initial sort of guidance for the steps we took actually stemmed from what my co-founder Dre and I are very, very aligned on, which is if you're going to start a company, you're going to build something new, like don't settle for 10% better than what's currently on the market, and really do try to build something that's step change sort of different and more impactful. And that requires sort of different orientation and a different set of steps for what you then decide to do. Because you could take a pretty cursory look at the market, especially in areas like chronic disease, and just times have changed. You know, there've been great contributions from a number of companies, but starting afresh, there's some obvious things that you could do to make product better, to make clinical services, you know, deeper. But for us, that's like insufficient because that's not going to realize, you know, the purpose that really is at the core of Miga. And so we've done a ton of consumer research and a ton of research with physicians. And that's really kind of our beating heart at Miga. We think research is extraordinarily important. You can't know everything, but you can learn a lot and you might have some surprises along the way. And heart health is one of those kind of key examples because I think some people and a number of companies have actually looked into this, which is we just need to make it easier to like buy medicines for conditions like hypertension. But I think the missed opportunity is to recognize, well, what is the job to be done? What are the real problems that consumers have? And what we hear time and time again is not like, I don't have mail order pharmacy, you know, I don't have access to this like latest and greatest blood pressure monitor. It's that I feel lost. I feel confused. I'm stressed and worried about my heart health. And what I desire are clear step-by-step plans and support to navigate this very scary, you know, path ahead of heart health. And if you take that as a starting point, which is really derived from a ton of consumer research, what you build and how you do it is like very different than if you really just think about it more superficially, which is you need medicines, you need doctors, and like you get better outcomes. But we think it's actually much more sort of nuanced than that.
Interesting. I'm curious more, you know, zooming out, going a little bit more high level. Whenever a founder thinks about entering the health tech space, they think about essentially three big challenges that they are to building a health tech company, which is why historically, perhaps, we've seen that health tech companies have struggled to get the kind of valuations you'll see, for example, for consumer social companies or something, or that kind of velocity, right, that they have. And it seems like the three main inhibiting factors are, one, distribution, right? A lot of the times your sales, if you're involving providers, can be top down, which is slow. The second is usually regulation, laws that force you to build software in a certain way. And the third is usually financial incentives because, you know, there's a lot of cost load in healthcare. So I'm curious, how do you think about these three inhibiting factors? And is there any one in particular that you're kind of focused on solving or doing differently, which will yield a competitive advantage for your company?
Yeah, and I actually see each of those. It is true that you have to navigate them. And on the one hand, I suppose you could call them inhibitors, but from our perspective, they're opportunities. Because you look in distribution, you know, regulation, and also sort of financial incentives, there is massive opportunity to do it right and to do it better and to actually build up sort of a multidimensional moat, you know, for your company. Take distribution, you know, as an example. You know, the market, you know, has changed prior to what it was before. But this approach of really pumping in raised capital into paid marketing and, you know, really going after, you know, top line growth, maybe with like a care model that never had clear path to sustainable, you know, unit economics, like it may not make a lot of sense. And it's also very specific to certain conditions that may not be replicable in others, which is quite the limitation. And that's why we see, say, through, you know, physicians and other sort of distribution channels, a very significant opportunity to do what you've seen in other industries, like you mentioned, which is to have more of a bottoms up distribution that's actually coupled with sort of top down, you know, contributions as well. That's really a product led motion. So you think about Slack or kind of you mentioned it, like how do you sort of, you know, capture and really sort of delight the everyday user, recognizing that maybe the ultimate sort of representative customer, is an employer, or in our case, like a payer. We think that there needs to be some fresh thinking about distribution in healthcare that actually represents a significant, opportunity for companies like Miga.
Very cool. I think that makes a lot of sense. Since you touched on distribution a little bit there, let's talk a little bit more about that. Let's dive in. I think there's two really important parts to understand about your distribution, right? First is, how do you acquire consumers? And the second is more your suppliers, right? How do you acquire healthcare providers? Especially the top providers might want to work with these kind of existing institutions like university-related hospitals at Stanford, UCSF, a Mayo Clinic, all these prestigious places that exist already. So why don't we first start by tackling consumers and maybe just give a high-level overview. What are like the kind of different channels and strategies that you use to acquire consumers?
And I think an important element of that, too, which comes down to the ultimate business model and strategy, is how many consumers do you need to hit key milestones and to push, the journey ahead. If you take the example of the type of companies that we were just touching on a second ago, it's sort of maybe not a growth at all costs, but you're really just trying to acquire as many consumers as possible. Through paid marketing, we're sort of like more is better. As we sort of chatted about in the first episode, we need a sufficient number of consumers to demonstrate the value of the model that we're building and that we can reliably achieve outcomes that other customers like employers and payers care about. What that means is it's solving for, say, like hundreds or thousands of consumers at a given moment of time, and not for the maximum number of consumers, because it's not necessary in order to kind of achieve that next milestone in sort of provability of what sort of Miga can offer, payers and employers. But then more tactically, you might be surprised, not that it's easy, not that it's free, but through paid marketing, Facebook, Instagram, etc., 1 in 2 adults have hypertension. Vast majority of people are really stressed and anxious about it. And with the right messaging and sort of like positioning, it may be more approachable than you might assume to sort of get people engaged with you at the outset. And so that's certainly part of how we think about sort of acquisition and sort of distribution at the outset. But it's not the forever strategy, but it's a recognition that that can be a very approachable piece of what we need, especially for the end size to get to those next milestones for us, which isn't 100,000 consumers, but it's actually, much less than that.
That makes sense. I like how you articulate it in terms of milestones, right? And provability. But I'm curious, when you think about channels of reaching these consumers, I think it's very nice that you guys have chosen a niche that is also very large, right? It's 1 in 2 adults in America. But do you reach them through, for example, content online? Are these direct message reach outs? Is it going person to person, knocking on people's doors? Is it Reddit? What are the key channels that you're thinking about right now?
I think ultimately there's going to be space for a lot of those different, tactics. And I think it comes back to the recognition that a more kind of traditional sequence of events for a company like Miga is that we would contract with a payer, we would contract with an employer. There'd be sort of top-down distribution and say like, hey, Miga's now covered, but there's no bottoms-up interest, familiarity. There's never been use of the product. And so you kind of get this disconnect. And you see with a lot of health tech companies where they have X number of covered lives, but what's ultimate like uptake and retention is very poor. And so that gets back to this like bottoms-up sort of product-led opportunity, that we see, that in order to support, there are a number of things that we can ultimately do. Part of the wedge in the approach that, we have will be this consumer app, which over time will have elements we hope of like virality and sort of multiplayer dynamics that can help with kind of peer-to-peer sort of sharing or sort of interest in using the consumer app. But then everything like you mentioned, sort of SEO, sort of pretty tried and true, but relatively new channels like TikTok and so forth. Over time, all of those will like have a role for what we're ultimately up to. But it ultimately has to be combined with the recognition that that doesn't mean that the consumer is ultimately the customer. Like you just need to have the affinity, the brand recognition, and the clear value proposition to them in that bottoms up motion that when you get the top down buy-in with the outcomes that we'll deliver with payers and employers, and that's part of the distribution, is that it then sort of comes together that the relevance in that distribution is that people actually use your product, which is part of the breakdown, right now is distribution is good, but only if people want to use your product over time, and that they're actually feeling like there's value, out of it.
That makes sense. I'm curious, how are you thinking about virality in the app, right? Anytime you have a point system, gamification, it obviously lends itself to that. But, pushing that viral coefficient over 1.0 usually takes a lot of effort and deliberate thinking and assessment. Are there any kind of interesting hacks that you were thinking about on engineering virality?
I think a lot of this, and will be, the same orientation that we've taken to a lot of the consumer and physician insights that really shape what we're up to sort of now, at Miga, is a lot of iteration, a lot of work with consumers, et cetera. Getting an initial app into test flight with a set of features, layering on features on that we've got perspective on, but really based on data as we see how people are kind of using and engaging with the app. I think one interesting sort of opportunity sort of in heart health is just the reality that a lot of people, not in like a Facebook, way where you want a big social network, but they basically have like family or sort of close-knit social graphs that they're sort of navigating their health with. Like, to give you an example that I think is interesting is like, I've got a young kid, he's 4, starting to learn how to read, like a Duolingo ABC or other products out there. There's a great sort of sharing function where you're actually creating connectivity between an initial user, those loved ones around them who are keeping tabs and want to know how things are going, but them themselves actually sort of need a product like Miga, just because heart health is ultimately relevant for everyone. And so we think there's significant opportunity sort of over time through that family graph or sort of social graph, and just the recognition that literally everybody needs something like Miga, when they're adults, if not, earlier, over time. That creates an interesting sort of opportunity for pushing, virality.
That's really cool. I think that's a very important realization that typically people that have health conditions have these kind of social graphs within their families. I'm curious, what about on the, provider side, right? How do you convince providers that want to work with the Mount Sinai's and the Weill Cornells of the world to come and work with you?
So I think there's sort of persuading clinicians to work with Miga and be part of our expanded team and to be down for the purpose we have. On that front, there's a real desire and a real reckoning that people know that we should be doing so much better in heart health, that they are super excited by the opportunity to be a part of that. There's then sort of the providers who are in more traditional practices who we would informally partner with to bring sort of Miga, to their patients. And I think this is another maybe like contrarian view, but, I used to do primary care before I left, residency. Primary care doctors, quite young, they care a lot. They know they're not doing great care. They may be burned out, but they also recognize the limitations of what they can do, and they're consumers themselves. And so they really have this appreciation and this desire for help from consumer product, and also an intuition, because they see it everywhere else in their life, except for their like day job, that there are consumer products that can do much, much better. And so if you take seriously primary care doctors who say they care about their patients and they will do what is needed in order to get the best outcomes, and you have a founding team DNA like our own, which I think frankly matters, is that they know I trained as a physician. They know we can talk shop, and they know that our purpose is like pure for what we're building, that it's much, much more approachable to work with providers than you might imagine. And then tactically, there are a lot of great examples from biotech, which is my, most immediate background, of building relationship at a local and regional level with physicians over time. That isn't rocket science, but it's also like a motion that is not normal in health tech that we think we can sort of pull over into building up, but that kind of bottoms up recognition and sort of affinity for Miga through like a medical affairs like function that you would see sort of in other parts of the healthcare industry.
Really cool. In the interest of time, let's move on to section number 3 here. So from a fundraising perspective, I'm curious, is there one unconventional fundraising tip that you have for aspiring health tech founders that you think is not common knowledge, is not something that early stage founders will hear regularly, like, for example, tell a story, et cetera? And so not like a basic tip, but something that might be unconventional.
I mean, and we're very, fortunate that we were able to sort of raise the round we did with really kind of A+, founders, many or A+ investors, many of whom were former founders and, and operators. And so it's not to minimize how hard it is to raise money, and that really you're trying to convince others. But I think there's sort of two things. I think one is really like turning the tables and trying to understand who the investors are, what their convictions are, and how they're going to kind of show up. And so it's not just you getting grilled, but it's you really striving to understand the investor. And so to make sure that it's a two-way conversation. But I think the other one that's not maybe as neatly, appreciated is, from my perspective, the importance of having excellent corporate counsel from the outset, and recognizing that a fundraise is not simply how much money you bring in and what your post-money valuation is and the size of the option pool, but there are 100 other terms that are relevant and that are going to matter sort of over time. And so it's not pencils down when you sign that term sheet. And in many respects, the most important phase to come is making sure you understand what you're signing, you understand what you're committing to, and that you actually have the expertise, even if you're a brand new company, to have a founder first sort of corporate counsel that's going to help you make sure that you get the best outcome possible. Because money and valuation, important, but there are a lot of other dimensions that are going to be really, really key as your company grows.
Awesome. You heard it, folks. Make sure to have good corporate counsel when you're raising money for the first time. Last section here, talking a little bit about operationalizing your business. What is one efficiency or workflow hack that you leverage to make sure that you guys are hitting your goals?
I mean, it's something we think a lot about. Like, as we think about how will Miga be successful, consumer engagement, full stack clinical services, get the great outcomes, but it's also building a world-class organization from time zero. And so what we've done is we've actually built out an operating system, which we call Miga OS. We've got more of a pros-based culture. We literally have people commit to operating principles for how we're going to treat one another and sort of get work done. And so one of the hacks that work consistently over time, to be honest, including all of the more mechanical things we do to support asynchronous sort of written work, is to elevate the fact that how you operate takes time, it takes work, and you as founders need to identify it as a key result, as part of the planning process, and as something that merits time, attention, investment, and discussion. And so it's something that we think is extraordinarily important, and it's something that we actually put on equal footing. Got to build a consumer app, but guess what? We also need to build a culture and an organization. And there are lots of little ways that shows up for us, but one of the most important ways we continue to have it show up is that we really identify it as Miga OS, our operating system. How do we build it? How do we take pride in it? And how do we sort of evolve it over time to meet the moment?
So you're essentially saying that you ask everyone on the team to take the operating model and the culture model as an OKR.
In terms of the build of the operating system, over time, in the sense that you can have a hack in the moment that maybe works for where you are as a company, and that's, additive. But ultimately, you're building a culture, you're building a set of operating principles that need to be flexible and agile, but be in support of that ultimate sort of purpose and that journey you're on. And so we literally have built out constitutional documents, purpose, vision, master plan, operating principles, how we work, how we use Slack, how we use Notion, to be quite forward and quite literal and putting pen to paper for what is the operating system of Miga, but then to recognize that it needs to change over time. And so that's what you sort of elevate, is that the products of Miga are not just the consumer app and clinical services, but one of our products is how we work and sort of is that organizational design. And so that's what I mean by elevating it. It's one of the products we're building, and we bring the same sort of rigor and the same intensity to our organization as we do to the other products that will be more on the market ultimately.
Awesome. That's very cool. I think we are just out of time now. So as we're wrapping up, Jarrad, is there anything you'd like to plug on the pod? I know you guys raised recently.
Yeah, always open to chat with folks about joining Team Miga. But I think even beyond that, hopefully one thing that's been sort of evident through these episodes is heart health has so few companies and so few founders, relative to what it should. And so I really encourage anyone to take the plunge and to really join Miga, whether with us or alongside us, and trying to make a better future, for heart health, and would consider myself totally available to support anyone who's embarking on a similar journey.
Awesome. That sounds great. And Jarrad, where is one place that our listeners could follow you? Is it Twitter? Is it LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter are perfect. So feel free to add me or shoot me a message on LinkedIn, or you can follow me on Twitter at Jarrad Aguirre.
Awesome. Cool. There you have it, folks. That's episode number 2. Jarrad, this was such a treat for me, and I'm sure it was for our listeners as well. Thank you so much for coming on the pod and sharing your insights. They were very well articulated, and hopefully we'll see you again one day.
Sounds perfect. Appreciate the conversation.
Awesome. All right. We'll see you next time on the breakouts, folks. Bye-bye. All right, and that wraps up today's episode. We really hope you enjoyed it. Now, just before I let you go, I wanted to reiterate one thing. We're trying to build the best podcast out there for aspiring entrepreneurs, and to do that, we need your help. The best way you can help us is by joining our Discord community. The link is in the description below, and then leaving us feedback. Tell us how we did. Tell us how we can improve. We're eagerly waiting to hear from you. Other than that, show us some love and follow us on Twitter at The Breakouts Pod. And I think that's everything I have for you. We'll see you next time on The Breakouts.